You'd like the line from your foot, where you're kind of pushing, to your hip, which is going to be the direction that your body travels, to be pointing as close as possible to the hold that you're trying to get to.
In this episode, Dan and Jason take a look at 3 different viewer-submitted climbs where each climber struggles with a big dynamic move. So for each one, we're going to first delve into an analysis of what went wrong, then we'll show practical demonstrations of what to do instead. As usual, Dan will be covering the technique explanations while Jason explains the underlying anatomy and mechanics. Let's begin with Broken Nail, a dyno involving lateral movement in Bulgaria, submitted by Alexander. First up, the analysis.
Lots of psych, lots of boost, but unfortunately he never really gets stood up over the foot. You can see he gets kind of flung off of the wall here as he gets kind of up and at it. And so he really would be able to reach this if he could just stand completely off of this foot. He doesn't particularly need to jump too far. It's just that at the sort of top motion of the dyno, he gets sort of like flung away. And so what we should be trying to look for is how to get his hips and body over that foot a little bit more so that he can take advantage of the legs to just kind of stand up. The hands, unfortunately, are fairly close together, and so it's pretty hard to control side-to-side motion when things are like nearby. Ideally, wider hands are going to let you do that a lot more. You normally don't get a choice of where your hands are. So if you're kind of pinned on the hands and you need to transition from side to side, you're going to want, if possible, to choose an off foot to sort of enable that. You don't really need this kind of runner stance because you know, it's not like a huge dyno. If you're going really far, you need to get as much out of both legs as possible. But for something of this size, it's really just about getting set up and enabling the right foot. So I think that the left foot looks like it's in a really nice place to get the right foot up. But once that's sort of settled, I would move my left foot a little bit over to the left. Obviously, it's great if there's a foot there. If there's not, you can still sort of like drop your heel and smear. All you need to do with it is use it for a little bit of push so you can kind of like swing your hips over the right foot to initiate. And as you do that, you're going to be able to drive and have a more direct line like that. If you don't manage to get far enough over the foot, as we've kind of talked about in previous videos, you're going to get just straight yeeted off the boulder in whatever direction your kind of heel to hip line goes. And so you get kind of thrown away at the end here.
All right, Dan, show us how it's done.
Dynamic movement in climbing is a very complicated area with a lot going on, but there's at least 3 things that I think are important and common to basically all jumps. And there are also things that I think are frequently neglected. The very first, and we see this come up whether it's a dynamic movement or an actual jump move, or in some cases just sort of popping around on the wall, or even static movements, is people frequently, they rarely overshoot, but they frequently don't drive their hips far enough over their foot. And so when they end up jumping, instead of having it propel them towards the hold that they want to go towards, they start to go in that direction and then get kind of flung back at the last second. And you'll see this on all kinds of climbing videos. Obviously it takes a lot of practice, but what you're really trying to do is you'd like the line from your foot, where you're kind of pushing, to your hip, which is going to be the direction that your body travels, to be pointing as close as possible to the hold that you're trying to get to. I'm going to try to demonstrate here real quick what it looks like when you have that point towards the hold versus point a little bit too far away from the hold. So there are 2 major ways to have this go slightly wrong. The first is that you don't go far enough over, and so that you find your body thrown back away from the hold rather than further towards the hold. The second one is, as you step across, your knee tracks in, and then you end up piking out away from the wall. So those are the 2 common mistakes of this type of step-up dyno. It works remarkably badly. There's a number of different ways to set up to do a dyno. Today we're just really going to be talking about this sort of split stance, kind of classic, sort of one leg up dyno. There's sort of 2 real things to think about. First is, how high does your generating foot need to be? If you put it higher than you need to, it's going to take a lot more effort than is really required to get up and over that hand, and it's going to take a lot more both grip strength and pull to keep yourself from just springboarding off of the wall. Both of those are going to make your life harder, and it's going to cut down on distance. So try to pick a foot, if it's available, that's kind of as low as will get you to the target. Secondarily is where you want to put your off foot to help support this. Generally speaking, if your hands are kind of just matched and you're going straight up, you want to be in a natural hip-wide stance like this. It's going to help you set, and that's going to get you up onto this foot to really boost and go as far as you can. It's going to be a little bit of like a slingshot kind of motion. You almost never want your support foot to be closer than hip width. That's going to cause you to have very little stability, and you're going to be falling away in one direction or the other, typically towards the low foot. That's also going to compromise your mechanics. Beyond that, the sort of more side to side you're going, generally the wider you want your off foot to be. It's going to be much easier to set up this kind of hip motion and get across to the hold. If you try to do something that's at all lateral with feet in line or even within your hips, it's going to be extremely hard to get that kind of side to side motion. So in this position, I'm set up perfectly to do a nice vertical dyno, just going straight up, but it's kind of hard for me to get too much momentum going side to side. Conversely, if I move my feet out some, it's much easier to kind of get stood up and lob in some direction sort of laterally. The last point that we're going to make here is when your hands are close together, it's much harder to control side to side motion. When they're out wide, almost regardless of what the shape is, you just have a lot more control, a lot more width. And so it's easier to kind of generate like side to side. When you have matched hands and you need to do something of a lateral dyno, it's a mistake to not take advantage of some swing to kind of get things initiated. A lot of times you'll see people with a high foot kind of just sag out and try to do one of these. Very difficult to get the distance. Tends to result in a little bit of a mismatch between how your hips and shoulders are moving, and it never really gets you towards the hold. So this is really prone to the kind of thing where it's like you come in and you both get tossed out and away from the wall. So anyways, remember, as this ties back to the beginning, which is I need my foot and hip to point towards the hand that I'm going towards. And if my hands are close together, the best way to do that is to do it with a hip setup, driving off of the opposite foot.
Next up, we've got Trail of Tears, involving a big vertical move in Lake Tahoe, submitted by Andre.
Pick up the foot. Pick up the foot. The lower one. Stop!
Let's see if we can analyze what went wrong here.
Who's the homie dead on the side?
I missed that before, actually.
Yeah.
This is the last person to attempt this climb, so
You must succeed.
just got carcassed. Good flexibility, good engagement, good rock across. This is another thing that seems to come up fairly often, and I think you've touched on it some, Jason. When they start to jump, it's like they open up their hips consciously to get into the wall, and then they sort of think, jump. And what happens a lot of times here is you start to open up, and then as you get into the more sort of natural human stride, the knee just subconsciously drives back into the wall, boop, and you end up kind of lobbing yourself away again. And so that's kind of how in this case he ends up with this slightly piked position here, which will pull you out a little bit, and it's certainly going to cost you a couple of inches, which might be all you need in this case. Even if you can't maintain that sort of like full 180-degree angle, which most people can't, just focusing on trying to keep your hips open throughout the motion is going to work a lot better.
When you're on your toes, that tends to have more bias towards the quads, which tends to decrease activation of the glutes. If you don't actually have any practice of trying to engage your glutes while on your toes, you're naturally not going to be that great at it. You're naturally going to want to use your quads more, which is why they totally turn into that position.
Yep.
A lot of training people will do with like squats, their heels are on the ground, right?
Yeah.
So there's this kind of disconnect, whereas the training you're doing isn't going to necessarily emulate what you're going to find while climbing. So I actually will have clients and patients work on like step-ups and crossover step-ups while they first have to learn the movement engaging their glutes properly, like with their heel down. But the progression is to do that step over or cross over step up just on their toe, but still keeping the glute engaged.
We're constantly reminded of how unique a sport climbing is when we consider even simple factors such as jumping. With regular jumping, honestly, the natural tendency is for our knees to want to slightly go into valgus to help engage the adductors and give us a little bit of added internal rotation. That internal rotation actually loads the glutes up a little bit more, which makes our jump that much more powerful. So in climbing, when we find ourselves externally rotated all the time, it's really unnatural to jump and generate a lot of power out of that motion. That's why we do some of these training drills for our lower half in a slightly more specific or functional manner, because the traditional way of practicing like a squat jump or even a broad jump won't necessarily translate as well to a movement where you're in more of an externally rotated position, like you would find yourself on the wall. A lot of these drills I'm about to show you can be incorporated into regular routine training, but they can also just be used as awareness drills. It's really important sometimes to recognize that the training that you do, if it's done quite far apart from your actual climbing, you may have some disconnect. So oftentimes these drills can be done immediately before climbing to just raise awareness of your body position and improve your climbing overall when you actually get on the wall. It's one thing to have the technique, but if you're not warmed up and ready to use those muscles or have the awareness, it'll be hard to properly execute. So at the most basic variation of this, I would really just focus on learning how to properly engage your glutes, which if you go really deep really early on is going to be much harder to be aware of what you're actually doing. So it seems kind of silly, but starting with like the smallest version of a squat and just focusing on a good pelvic thrust forward to squeeze the glutes is extremely beneficial. And then all you have to do is go slightly deeper and deeper as you get into that motion. And I prefer eventually getting more into like a sumo squat type motion, focusing on the good glute engagement when you go down. The sumo squat type motion is pertinent because it's just more realistic for the wall. Your chest is going to stay a little bit further up compared to a traditional squat, where your head's not going to go into the wall like that. It's not going to be as functional. And also you often find yourself in these externally rotated positions. So once again, just much more functional for climbing. So once you have the basic awareness of the glutes engaged and ready to fire, it's time to move on to some more complicated drills. Another challenge is actually learning to engage your glutes while you're on your toes. Climbing is often on the toes and not done on the heels. So doing a basic squat with weight into your heels isn't going to translate perfectly well over to climbing, but it's going to be easier to teach you how to actually engage the glutes. Once you have that mastered, you're going to want to go not only to a single leg, but you're going to want to go onto your toes. So something like using a step and trying to be able to keep pressure on your toes while pushing through your glutes is going to be really pertinent. So if you can drive through that leg, while keeping onto the toes and keeping all of that coordination and engagement going, then you're going to really feel like you can engage the glutes while firing through the legs. If you feel like the bench is too high or you can't get it right off the bat, it's okay to start with your heel down and work on firing through the glutes. And once you feel like you can successfully do it with your heel on the bench still, then try and come up onto the toe. Now, a little more advanced variation of that I like a lot too is going to be a crossover. Even harder, I'd suggest probably starting with a lower bench than this one. But if you cross over, you're going to really load that glute. It's a lot more specific to some climbing movements. Pressing off the toe right off the bat, I can get that glute engaged. And then you come up and back down. So once again, engaging the glute, pressing up, and coming back down. So if you can get that, then I think you're ready for the next drill. The next one I like to call a power up. It's a actual powerful move, and I name it after a classic video game, which you might recognize. If you do, be sure to comment down below. So an initial version, you just want to be straight on, and you're just going to power up off of one leg, getting as much height as you can while also trying to keep that glute engaged and active. Now, to make it a bit more climbing specific, if you open up your hips a little bit, then you can do that same move, but now we're going to apply it to a much more climbing specific move. You want to be even more careful on your active landing zone, so no Dan shoes.
No what?
No Dan shoes. But again,
The phone's fine though.
and just make sure you have some practice with some type of dynamic movement or jumping, because you don't want to have your knee falling all over the place. It's a good idea to set up a camera maybe to make sure you're tracking well and not landing with your knee falling into a lot of valgus or dropping in, because you want to stay safe while performing this. So up, control, and make sure you're using the glutes with the lower half. I find doing drills like this as part of a warm-up is not only pretty casual, but can be really pertinent for those initial climbs that you do, because you get your legs and your glutes warmed up, you increase that awareness, and then once you get on the wall, you actually use your legs like you're supposed to while climbing, and you get good coordination from your toe to your glutes, transfers into your arms, and will make your climbing feel a whole lot easier right off the bat.
Last but not least, let's take a look at an interesting elimination climb called Black Plague in Berkeley, California, that tests the limits of Rachel's wingspan.
Come on. Come on. Yes.
She obviously is like not very extended in the leg, you know, so she could get much, much higher. But I think the biggest problem for her is going to end up just being like total net wingspan. As long as she's kind of wide out here, she's not going to get all the distance she can. I would actually consider doing it with the left heel, because that is going to let you just sort of stay more extended off of the right arm as you stand up. That's going to cost some power and some sort of total height. But since she's at like 90 degrees in the knee there, I mean, more than that even, right? It's like she has so much extra to use here. I don't think that it would be really disadvantageous to do that. But the final thing is something we've talked about before, which is I think that the right foot is in a good place to set the left foot. But if she can, bringing it somewhere higher, anywhere higher, hard to tell what the lighting is. But it seems like conceivably she could, from this slightly lower position, she could get settled up on that, walk her feet back down, and get like an opposition foot before setting the left. Because once the left foot is set this high, she's going to be really pretty pinned here. So once this is established, it's going to be pretty difficult to move her right foot nicely. It's going to be kind of that like hop jitter sort of step.
We've sort of cobbled together a climb here to help us explore what's going on with Rachel's climbing at Mortar Rock. And these are a few tips that will be helpful for short people, as well as anyone who's climbing a boulder that's really spanned for them. So kind of no matter how tall you are, there's some reachy stuff out there, and hopefully this will be helpful. The two sort of main things that we're trying to look for is how to get all of the slack out of the system. We don't want anything where we could be more angled to get more distance. We don't want anything where we're sagged out from the wall and not able to be as sucked in and sort of like extended as possible. And we want to select heel hooks versus toe hooks so that we're able to sort of like maximally extend between the hold positions, and we're not giving up any space that we don't have to. A sort of simple rule of thumb, it very much depends on the climbs and people's style and things, but a generally good guideline is when you're doing stuff like this, if your foot is inside of the box of your hands, you want to consider a toe, and if it's outside the box of your hands, it's generally good to consider a heel. They can work in different ways, of course, but if I was looking at a new climb and trying to guess how I was going to try to do something, I would probably start with that sort of guideline. So kind of the last thing to consider here is when I select my kind of like support foot, my help foot, I want to get it into a position where the more laterally I'm going, the wider out I want it to be. And additionally, I want it set up so that I can help get my hips over my foot and have that line pointing towards the hold, as we've discussed in a couple of other videos. For this first move, the starting foot is kind of in line with my right hand, so I could probably choose a heel or a toe, whatever I like better. But just given the angle and the shape of the hold, I noticed that it's going to sit in on a toe probably more favorably. So set up here, get my left foot set to kind of push and assist. Swoop. High foot, just like Rachel does. Push foot with the right. Big ol' spin. Reset the right hand. And a little boost to full. If I'm going to be really spanned, it's really, really important that my shoulders point to the hold that I'm going to. If I, like so many people do, kind of generate and reach, it's going to really short me here. And I get several inches just by remembering to cock my shoulders and reach across like this, rather than being in this kind of more like wide out position. It's really important that you get this going rather than that.
Was kind of thinking of a point you've made in the past of like kind of reverse engineering part of this, keeping the right hand on, going into that left fold, so however she needs to, whether that's a
ladder,
super
push,
spot,
down climb.
ladder, etc. Yeah. And then that way, like when she's in that position, search for that foot.
Yeah.
And see what feels good, what allows her that nice in between of isn't so high that it would be really hard to get in from the bottom, but isn't so low that she's where she is right now and like, you know,
there's just no hope of.
yeah, she's just fully extended.
The concept of reverse engineering involves somehow getting into or past that crux movement and then establishing what you need for the specific foot or the core tension, shoulder positioning, etc., to then make that move a little bit easier the next time you try it. This may involve a power spot, a ladder, using other holds to get into that position, etc. What we're demonstrating here is obviously not the exact movement that Rachel did, but rather just to help show the general concept. All right, so I'm gonna pull onto this climb and I'm just gonna kind of see what feels natural to get going here. And right off the bat, this first move feels kind of desperate. Obviously I didn't like that setup, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go under the move, set up, and see what I was missing. So now that I get on here, I kind of quickly realize it would be much better if I had my foot somewhere to help me. So if I establish here, okay, so now I realize I can off-weight that left hand a lot better. So I'm gonna see if I can put that foot on before I try the move. There it is. So just by putting that foot on first, that first move went from kind of low percentage, a little desperate, a little dead pointy, to something I could basically static just by having more engagement and bounce through my feet. This is why it's one of my favorite tactics to use while trying to unlock a certain move, because you can save a whole bunch of time rather than just repeating the same movement over and over again. You can try and figure out the position that would make it a lot easier and unlock the climb.
That was a lot of information, so let's finish this video with a recap of what we learned. First, when trying to move at all laterally, there are a few mistakes you should avoid. Not driving your hips over your toes will cause you to push yourself away from the hold you're trying to reach. Placing the driving foot too high will cause mobility issues and sap energy. Placing the support foot too close to your midline will make balancing and generating lateral movement difficult. And especially with matched hands, not swinging your hips will make it harder to generate lateral momentum. Next, with vertical dynamic moves, pay attention to how open or externally rotated your hips are. It's common to let your knee turn into the wall too early, which pushes your hips away from the wall and shorts your reach. A big reason this happens is because it's not a very natural movement for humans, which is all the more reason to practice good glute engagement while you're on your toes. And finally, whether you're short or tall, you're bound to find climbs that test your wingspan, and in that case you need to pay special attention to eliminating slack in your body. This can be achieved by angling your shoulders toward the hold you're going to, determining whether a heel hook or toe will give you maximum reach, and making sure you're not shorting yourself by forgetting any other of the guidelines in this video. If you want to be featured in one of these videos, follow us on Instagram at HoopersBetaOfficial, where we regularly ask for submissions, and until next time, train, climb, send, and repeat.